The noise of the city pressed in from all sides, the shrill honking of cars, the monotonous rhythm of footsteps and voices merging into an endless hum. People with businesslike faces hurried forward without noticing each other. For them, the morning was another day full of tasks and meetings, but for him it was a day of struggle for another piece of bread. Leonardo sat on the cold curb, hunched over, as if trying to hide from the universe. His fingers, weathered and cracked, clutched the cardboard on which was carelessly scrawled, "Hungry, help." He had long ago gotten used to people turning away. The blank stares, the fleeting pity, the indifference, it had become his new reality. But at that moment, something changed. A figure swept through the stream of indifferent faces, making the air around them seem to stop. A tall man in a tracksuit, dark glasses on his face, a confident gait. He moved easily and casually, as if not noticing the pressing crowd. His light-colored sneakers tread on the dirty asphalt as if the city belonged only to him. Leonardo couldn't believe his eyes at first. "Is that him? It can't be," he whispered to himself, and his heart beat like it was going to burst out of his chest. Cristiano Ronaldo, a legend of soccer, an icon whose name was known even to those who had never seen a soccer ball. There was still noise around, but for Leonardo the city was still. He watched as the star leisurely steps past, and every movement of the athlete seemed unreal, as if slow motion in a movie. Leonardo felt something tighten in his chest, a sudden impulse, a barely perceptible urge. He didn't know where the courage came from, but he rose to his feet. "Hey, Mr." His voice was hoarse, like an old radio, and almost drowned in the flow of street noise. Ronaldo didn't hear. He walked past, and Leonardo, limping desperately on his right leg, rushed after him. Only one thought pounded in his head. "Try. This is your chance. Mister!" Louder this time. Leonardo touched Ronaldo's sleeve. The soccer player stopped abruptly and turned around. Leonardo recoiled, almost afraid of his own insolence. Ronaldo looked down at him. His gaze was sharp, attentive, but without a hint of rudeness. For a moment, their eyes met. "What?" Ronaldo's voice was low and calm, but there was an underlying tension. "Please, can you give me $1? Leonardo whispered, his voice shaking like an aspen leaf. He didn't ask for more. $1. One small token of hope. The crowd began to slow down. Passers-by, as if sensing something unusual, began to turn around. Uninvited glances fell on the two men, one shining like a star, the other a barely perceptible shadow of the world. The contrast between them was so great that it seemed almost absurd. Ronaldo was silent. He looked at Leonardo, his faded eyes, the scarred face, and his empty, dirty hands. Time around him slowed down. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. And then, to the surprise of everyone, Cristiano slowly lowered his hand into his pocket. Leonardo held his breath, and passers-by froze in anticipation. What will happen next? At that moment, no one knew that Ronaldo's reaction would change everything, not only for Leonardo, but for everyone who witnessed the encounter. Leonardo stood in front of Cristiano Ronaldo, hunched over as if under the weight of an invisible weight. His fingers nervously tugged at the worn sleeve of his old coat, which had long since fallen off. His face was riddled with deep wrinkles and scars, the marks of a life of struggle and defeat. $1. Please, he repeated, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled. Ronaldo continued to stare at him without taking his eyes off him. The gaze was intense, but impenetrable, as if the footballer were trying to see something deeper, something invisible to everyone else. Leonardo felt every moment of that silence digging into his chest with sharp needles. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. $1, Ronaldo finally said. His voice sounded calm, but there was surprise in it. Leonardo nodded, feeling his cheeks begin to burn with shame. He knew what it looked like. A millionaire, a world champion, surrounded by wealth and fame, and he, a man in rags who couldn't find the strength to ask for more. But that dollar contained everything, the last hope, the desperation, and the desire not to be completely lost to the world. "I won't ask for more, sir," Leonardo muttered, his voice hoarse as if he had swallowed nails. "I need $1 to prove to myself that I still mean something." The words came out suddenly, and Leonardo immediately regretted them. He wasn't going to talk about his feelings. He just wanted that dollar as a symbol that it could still be seen, that it wasn't just dust on the shoes of those who walked by. The crowd around started to thicken. People, smelling the scent of sensation, took out their phones, taking pictures and videos. A whisper ran through them like a light breeze. "It's Ronaldo. What's he doing? Look at this guy. Is he seriously asking Cristiano for $1? Leonardo heard them, but tried not to notice. He looked directly at Ronaldo. His eyes, normally dull and empty, suddenly filled with something strange, a mixture of pleading and despair. Beneath that mask of despair was the tragedy of a lifetime. "You don't have to. Just pass by," Leonardo muttered, taking a step back. He had already prepared himself for the worst, for an indifferent rejection, for a scornful look or laughter from the crowd. He had seen it 1,000 times before, but Ronaldo didn't turn away. He stood there, unmoving, as if still deciding what to do. Something flashed in his eyes, a barely perceptible hesitation, a glimpse of human weakness hidden beneath the armor of confidence and glory. $1, he repeated quietly, more to himself. For a moment it seemed as if time had stood still again. Leonardo felt something in his chest tighten with pain. Why was this so difficult? Why did $1 suddenly become such a heavy burden for him? "I've lost everything," Leonardo said suddenly, as if the words had found their way out. "My family, my home, myself. $1 is not money. It's my faith in people." Ronaldo raised his eyebrows, surprised by the admission. It seemed he hadn't expected to hear it. The crowd froze too and stopped whispering. Now everyone was looking at the homeless man, trying to see more in him than just tattered clothes and dirt on his face. "I know who you are," Leonardo continued, his voice suddenly firmer. "The whole world knows you. You have everything. But sometimes one good deed is enough to change everything. $1. That's all I ask." The silence hung between them, thick and heavy, like a black cloud before a thunderstorm. Ronaldo didn't answer, his hand still in his pocket. And at that moment, no one knew whether he would give the dollar or just walk on by. But no matter what happened next, Leonardo knew one thing: he had done all he could. Now his fate was in the hands of a man who was used to changing the outcome of matches in stadiums. Only this time the game was not for a trophy, but for simple hope, and it seemed that the whole city held its breath, waiting for the legend's decision. The crowd froze, as if the street itself had lost its breath for a moment. People stopped moving. Cars crept slowly along the road, but even their engines seemed quieter than usual. In the center of it all stood two people, separated not only by distance but by entire worlds. Cristiano Ronaldo was silent. His gaze, hard and cold, was directed straight at Leonardo. This silence was stronger than any words. Leonardo could not understand what he saw in the eyes of the soccer star: sympathy or condemnation, fear or indifference. Ronaldo's eyes, hidden behind the gloss of his public image, seemed almost alien at that moment. They were studying Leonardo, as if they were trying to take him apart piece by piece, to look into his soul and understand what was behind his words. It wasn't just a look. It was a question that Leonardo could not answer. The world around him began to blur. Leonardo suddenly felt the cold creeping through the soles of his worn shoes. He wanted to hide again, to disappear back into the alleys, away from the burning stairs and cameras aimed at him. "Say something, please," ran through his head. But Ronaldo remained silent. His face remained impenetrable, like a sculpture carved from marble. What was he thinking? Was he regretting stopping? Was he trying to decide if he should get involved in this story or just walk away like anyone else would? $1, Leonardo repeated hoarsely, his voice trembling. Ronaldo's eyes squinted slightly. He took a barely perceptible breath, and Leonardo suddenly saw in him not just a soccer icon, but a man who, like everyone else, doubts and hesitates. The moment seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Tension hung in the air, heavy and sticky. Passers-by, like hungry predators, watched Ronaldo's every movement, every micro-gesture of his face. Some were already whispering, "He's just going to walk away." "No, look," he's thinking. "What if he does something incredible?" Ronaldo lowered his head a little, and his gaze softened, as if he saw something more than a dirty and haggard man in front of him. A human being. His fingers were still in his pocket, but he hesitated. Why? Leonardo suddenly realized that it was a choice for Cristiano, a small gesture that could mean nothing to a footballer, but could turn the world upside down for him. And it was not an easy choice, not for someone who was used to being in the public eye, whose actions were always discussed by millions. "Why?" Ronaldo's voice suddenly came out, low and quiet. It seemed to cut the tension in half. "Why do you only need $1? Leonardo flinched. He had not expected this question. His mind raced like a frightened beast. How to explain? How to tell of the despair, of the fact that this dollar was not money but hope? "That's all I need," he whispered, barely able to keep the lump in his throat. To not feel invisible. Ronaldo didn't respond, but something in his gaze changed. His eyes, which had seemed cold, suddenly warmed, as if the ice had begun to melt under the fire of someone else's pain. A few more seconds passed before Ronaldo took his hand out of his pocket. It wasn't $1 in his fingers. He held out something more to Leonardo, and in that moment the world around him seemed to explode. People gasped, cameras zoomed in, and everything got even louder. But Leonardo heard nothing. He looked only at the soccer player's outstretched hand, not understanding what was happening. At that moment he realized that his life would never be the same again. Leonardo froze, his heart pounding so loudly that he could barely hear the noise around him. All eyes were fixed on one point: Cristiano Ronaldo's hand, which slowly descended to the pocket of his sports pants. The gesture, at first glance ordinary, turned out to be almost theatrical. The crowd held its breath. Someone raised the phone higher. Someone froze with his mouth open, as if anticipating something incredible. Leonardo couldn't look away. Everything inside him was screaming, "Don't go. Don't leave me like the others." This hope was like a razor sharp and ready to turn into a new disappointment at any moment. Ronaldo silently pulled out a thin black wallet, his movements measured and fluid, like a man used to the attention of thousands of people. The light reflected off the metal logo on the leather, and Leonardo thought about how much this little piece of luxury was worth. Probably more than he'd earned in the last few years. "What's he doing?" whispered someone in the crowd. "He's just giving money and leaving," said another voice. But Ronaldo did neither. He opened his wallet and time seemed to stop. Leonardo saw the footballer's thin fingers touch a stack of bills. They weren't dollars, but euros, whole hundreds of them, neatly folded and smelling of something Leonardo hadn't seen in years. Opportunity, freedom, a life that seemed so far away he'd almost forgotten what it looked like. But Ronaldo was in no hurry. He held the wallet open, his gaze flicking to the crowd, then back to Leonardo. There was no longer coldness in his eyes. There was a strange mixture of questions and answers that no one dared to voice out loud. "Tell me," Ronaldo said quietly, his voice almost inaudible against the whispers of the others. $1. Why are you asking for so little?" Leonardo swallowed, his throat dry. It was a simple question, but it burned through him. Leonardo felt himself turning into a man made of glass, fragile and transparent, under the gaze of the soccer player and the crowd. He suddenly became unbearably ashamed. For what? For his weakness? For the life that had brought him here? For standing in front of the world, naked and defenseless? $1, he started, but the words stuck in his throat. He averted his gaze, looked down at his muddy shoes. "Because I'm not standing any more." The words sounded lower than a whisper, but Ronaldo heard them. The crowd murmured, as if people suddenly couldn't contain their emotions. Some laughed, some shook their heads, and some looked at Leonardo as if seeing him for the first time. "Not worth it?" Ronaldo repeated, his voice harder, firmer. "Do you really think so?" Leonardo nodded without raising his head, and then something happened that no one expected. Ronaldo suddenly pulled the entire stack of banknotes out of his wallet, large, heavy euro bills. He held them in his hand, and the crowd exploded. "Jesus, he's going to give him the money? It's a publicity stunt. It's a show. Look at him, he's serious." But Ronaldo didn't give them to Leonardo. He held the pack in front of him, but his gaze was penetrating, almost accusing. "Money means nothing if you don't believe in yourself," Ronaldo said. His words sounded firm, but there was a spark of something personal, something deep in them. He seemed to be speaking not only to Leonardo, but to himself. The crowd fell silent. All the noise suddenly evaporated, as if the whole city had turned its ear to the scene. "You're asking for $1 because you think you're worthless, but you're a human being, and you have the right to demand more." He leaned closer, his eyes boring into Leonardo. "So, what do you really want?" Leonardo stared at him, unable to believe his ears. Those words, that look, they shook him to the core. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to breathe. He could not find the strength to answer. And Ronaldo continued to stand in front of him, holding a wad of money that suddenly wasn't just money anymore. It became something much more, a symbol that someone sees you, hears you, believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. And in that moment, when the world seemed to stand still in anticipation, Leonardo realized that his life was forever divided into before and after. The crowd was silent. People clutched their phones in their hands, their screens reflecting the trembling light. Everyone wanted to capture this moment, as if anticipating that something truly important was about to happen. In the center of this chaos stood two people, a homeless man, weathered by life, and a soccer icon worshipped by the whole world. Cristiano Ronaldo had a wad of money in his hand, but he was in no hurry to hand it to Leonardo. His eyes were focused and full of the hard determination with which he had taken to the pitch in the most important moments of his career. This wasn't just an act of charity, it was a challenge. "You said you weren't worth more than $1, Ronaldo began, his voice clear and firm, like striking a taut string. "But I'm not giving you $1. A whisper rippled through the crowd like a gust of wind before a storm. People exchanged surprised glances. Some snickered, some grinned, expecting the usual. Ronaldo to turn away and walk away, leaving this man standing on the cold pavement. But Ronaldo continued, "I'll give you a choice." Leonardo raised his head. His gaze was full of despair and confusion. He didn't understand. The choice? What was he talking about? "This money." Ronaldo raised his hand with a wad of bills for all to see. "It's not just paper, it's a tool. You can take it now and live for a few more weeks, maybe months. Spend it on food, clothes, a roof over your head, but it will be temporary." He fell silent, and the tension in the crowd became unbearable. Someone whispered, "Is he mocking him?" "No, look at his eyes. He's serious." Leonardo swallowed. He didn't know what to say. "Or," Ronaldo continued, his voice quieter, almost intimate, as if he were speaking only to Leonardo, "you don't have to take that money. Instead, I'll help you find a job, a place to live, learn something new. It's going to be hard, harder than just taking $1 or even this whole bundle. But at the end, you'll be able to look at yourself and see not a beggar, but a person who has won." The crowd gasped. Someone laughed loudly in surprise, but the laughter quickly died down. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a challenge no one expected. Ronaldo, a star who could afford to just walk away, suddenly decided to break the usual script. He wasn't just giving money, he was giving choices. Leonardo froze, his thoughts racing, his head spun with words that seemed too unreal. "A job? A place to live? A new chance? Is this a joke? Why are you doing this?" His voice shook. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Ronaldo looked at him with an expression that was both stern and warm. "Because someone once believed in me when I was nothing. Now it's your turn." The crowd murmured louder. People argued, the whispers turning into rumblings. Is he trying to change his life? Who does that anyway? It's Ronaldo. He could have just given him the money and walked away. But for Leonardo, the whole world had narrowed down to that moment. Ronaldo's eyes, his words, they struck deeper than any blow of fate. He felt something in his chest clench and grow at the same time. Hope mixed with fear. "Yeah, I don't know if I can," he whispered, lowering his gaze. "You can do it," Ronaldo replied firmly, extending his hand. "The question is whether you are ready to try." Leonardo looked at the hand, strong and sure, as if reaching across an abyss. He saw in it not just help, but a path that was difficult and scary. But if he agreed, he could stop hiding from himself for the first time in years. He hesitated, his fingers trembling, but finally he raised his hand and touched Ronaldo's palm. Their fingers interlocked, and at that moment the crowd exploded in applause. People were screaming, making videos, laughing and crying all at the same time. But Leonardo didn't hear them. He looked at Ronaldo, and for the first time in years there was a light in his eyes, a light of faith that he could still change his life. Ronaldo smiled, genuinely and humanly. "This is just the beginning," he said. And in that moment, Leonardo realized that this day changed his destiny forever. Leonardo's hand still rested in Ronaldo's, as if it were the only thing keeping him on the surface in the raging ocean of life. The crowd around him cheered, some kept filming, some applauded, but these sounds merged for him into an inaudible noise, like a white hum on the edge of consciousness. In that moment, everything ceased to exist. The noise of the city, the cold air, the people. All that remained was him and the man in front of him who had spoken the words that burned him from the inside out. Leonardo's lips quivered, and his eyes suddenly filled with tears. He didn't realize it right away. The tears came so rarely that he'd almost forgotten how they stung his cheeks. One by one, the heavy drops fell on his ragged coat, leaving dark stains. He didn't try to hold them back. There was no more strength to hold them back. His breathing became ragged, and he suddenly took a step back, covering his mouth with his hand. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The world around him was fuzzy, and all he could feel was a burning pain in his chest that kept him from breathing. "Hey." Ronaldo spoke softly, his voice softer, lacking the firmness with which he had challenged him a few minutes earlier. He looked at Leonardo anxiously, as if he was afraid he was about to collapse right in front of him. Leonardo looked up. His eyes were full of tears, and in them read a lifetime of lost years, broken hopes, dank nights spent on the cold concrete. In that moment, he didn't look like a beggar. He looked like a man who was carrying a burden that was too heavy for one heart to bear. Why are you doing this?" he wheezed, finally finding his voice. His words shook like himself. Ronaldo was silent, only looking at him. There was more support in that silence than in thousands of words. Leonardo felt it, and could no longer hold back the flow. He fell to his knees on the sidewalk, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The crowd around them quieted down. People who had been making noise a second ago fell silent, stunned by what was happening. The cameras continued filming, but even through the screens you could feel the gravity of the moment. A picture no one expected to see. A world-famous athlete standing in front of a homeless man crying like a child in the middle of a crowded street. "Yeah, nobody needs me anymore," whispered Leonardo. His words were barely audible, but Ronaldo caught them. "Everyone has forgotten me, and I've forgotten myself." Ronaldo squatted down in front of him. Their eyes met again. This time there was no pity or judgment in his gaze, only understanding. Understanding the pain that had been building up in his soul for years until it came out in such a flood. "You are not forgotten," Ronaldo replied calmly. His voice was deep and confident. "You are still here. You are alive. And as long as you are alive, you have a chance." Leonardo sobbed and raised his head. No one had ever spoken to him like that, never looked at him like that. He saw in Ronaldo's eyes not just a great athlete, but a man who saw right through him and didn't look away. "I don't know if I can—" Leonardo's voice trailed off. "You can do it," Ronaldo said firmly. He held out his hand and helped Leonardo up. "But you have to believe it yourself." Leonardo stood on his feet, staggering like a baby taking its first steps. For him, this moment was more important than anything that had happened in recent years. He didn't just rise physically, he felt something inside him move for the first time in a long time. Tears were still streaming down his cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release from the pain, from the shame, from the burden he'd been carrying for so long. "I'll give you my hand," Ronaldo added quietly, "but you have to go further on your own." The crowd began to whisper again. Some were crying, some were watching the scene, unable to contain their emotions. But for no one this moment had passed without a trace. Leonardo nodded, trying to hold back the trembling in his knees. He didn't know what would happen next. He was afraid. But for the first time in years, there was a spark of faith in him, small but strong enough to illuminate the darkness he had lived in for so long. "Thank you," he whispered, looking into Ronaldo's eyes. "We'll see you again," Ronaldo replied with a slight smile that seemed to say, "It's not over yet." And at that moment, the whole world realized it was not just a meeting. It was a turning point in the fate of a man who had finally decided to stand up and move forward. The cold sun was sinking below the horizon when Leonardo, still shaking with emotion, stood in front of Ronaldo. Emptiness flashed in his eyes again, as if something inside had brought him back to another long-forgotten world. A world where he was not a ragged man on the margins of life, but someone else. Someone happy, loved, alive. Once upon a time, many years ago, Leonardo had a life that seemed simple, but as real as any other. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town with his wife, Alice, and a little daughter whom they called a ray of sunshine. The house was old but cozy. In the evenings, there was always light in the windows and the aroma of coffee and fresh-baked goods wafted from the kitchen. "Daddy!" cried little Sarah, running barefoot across the squeaky floor. "Give me a ride on your shoulders." Leonardo laughed, picked her up in his arms, and twirled her around the room until the girl's laughter filled the house. His wife, with a smile on her face, watched them and hummed the tune she always sang in the morning. It was his world, quiet, simple, and filled with love. He worked in a small factory as a mechanic. His salary was barely enough to live on, but they were happy. Leonardo always said, "We are poor, but we have everything." But life is a cruel scriptwriter, and then one day, everything fell apart. It was December. It had been a particularly harsh winter that year. Leonardo was working overtime to buy Sarah a Christmas present. She dreamed of a doll she had seen in a big store window, and he promised himself, "I will buy it, no matter what it costs me." That evening, he stayed late at work. His phone was in the locker room, and he couldn't hear the dozens of calls Alice was trying to make. When he finally got home, the street was lit only by the blue lights of the police. Leonardo froze at the gate, looking up at the puffs of black smoke rising into the night sky. No, no, no. He rushed toward the house, but a fireman stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir. The fire was started by faulty wiring. Your wife and daughter were in the house. We didn't get there in time." Those words killed him. In 1 second, his life was ripped from his hands, like a doll that was not destined to fall into the hands of little Sarah. Leonardo was kneeling in front of the ruins of his house, clutching the toy gift he never got to give. From that moment on, he was no longer himself. Leonardo tried to fight, but the darkness inside him grew every day. He lost his job. His hands were shaking and his head was filled with memories of how he had failed, how he had not saved. Friends and acquaintances tried to help at first, but the more Leonardo lost himself, the faster they disappeared from his life. Eventually, he sold everything he had left. First an old car, then his wife's wedding ring. Last to go was her cinnamon and vanilla-scented scarf that she liked to wear in the winter. "I'm sorry, Alice. I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered each time he lay down on the cold asphalt under the bridge. All that was left of his past life was pain and emptiness. Leonardo stopped believing in people. His faith in himself died with his family. He became a shadow, a figure that no one notices in the noisy streets. Now, standing in front of Cristiano Ronaldo, Leonardo remembered every second of that pain. His request for $1 wasn't just a request for money. It was the final cry of a soul that wanted to be seen. That dollar meant to him that someone still saw him, still believed he existed. "I've lost them." His lips suddenly fell open. Leonardo's voice was barely audible, but he couldn't stop himself. "I lost them because of me. I didn't have time to save them." Ronaldo listened silently. There was no more surprise in his eyes, only sympathy and understanding. He didn't try to comfort, didn't interrupt. He let Leonardo speak. $1, Leonardo continued, his eyes filling with tears again. "It's not money. It's proof that I'm still alive, that someone remembers me." Ronaldo stepped forward and put his hand on Leonardo's shoulder. "It wasn't your fault." The soccer player's voice was quiet but full of power. "But you can start over. Your family would want you to live. They wouldn't want to see you like this." Leonardo sobbed, his shoulders shuddering with a new flood of tears. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that. "You deserve more than $1, Ronaldo continued. "But to realize that, you have to prove it to yourself." Those words broke through the wall of pain Leonardo had been building for years. He suddenly realized that for the first time in years, someone was not just looking at him, but seeing him. He stood silent, tears streaming down his cheeks, but there was a faint spark in the depths of his eyes, a spark that said that maybe all was not lost. At that moment, he felt for the first time that he was not alone. Outside, chaos still reigned. Phone cameras glowed like stars in the night sky, aimed at the center of what was happening. Cristiano Ronaldo and an emotional Leonardo. People were no longer just watching. They were part of the story. The whispers turned into a loud rumble of amazement, admiration, and angry curiosity. "Did you see that? He says he's going to give him a second chance." "It's a PR stunt. Don't believe it. There they are, the cameras. It's all for show." "What about this poor guy? How did he end up like this?" Some in the crowd were crying, others laughing, videotaping what was happening. It was much more than a clash of wealth and poverty. It was a clash of worldviews, of humanity and cynicism. And, as is often the case, the news traveled at the speed of light. Journalists appeared as quickly as if they had been waiting for this moment all their lives. Several bulky cameras and microphones pushed through the crowd. One of the reporters, a young man with a bright red press card on his chest, was the first to take the floor, pointing the microphone directly at Ronaldo's face. "Mr. Ronaldo, why did you decide to help this man? What's behind your action?" Ronaldo looked up, his gaze hard and cold. "Are you really wondering why? Or do you want another headline?" He answered sharply, as if to cut off all superficial questions in one fell swoop. The journalist was silent, but the microphones kept buzzing like bees. People were demanding answers. This case had become a sensation before it was over. Social media has taken the world by storm. The video of Leonardo standing with tears in his eyes and Ronaldo holding a wad of money instantly went viral. Millions of comments appeared within minutes. "Hero or hypocrite?" the headlines asked. Ronaldo did what no other millionaire would do. Another PR stunt on someone else's misfortune. Who's the homeless guy? Why hasn't anyone cared about his story before? The internet split into two camps. One admired Ronaldo. Finally, a star is finally using his influence not to promote brands, but to really help. This is a lesson for all of us. How many times do we walk by and not notice people who are asking for help? Others were less favorable. It's too ostentatious. Why not help in silence? What are all these cameras for? It would have been better if he'd given him the money in silence. What? The guy owes him his whole life now? Discussions began on the central TV channels. The talk shows invited experts who with serious faces analyzed Ronaldo's act and Leonardo's fate as if it were a game of chess. This gesture is symbolic. It shows that poverty is not a sentence if someone is willing to believe in you, said one of the guests. But who's going to believe the other millions of homeless people? Why would he choose to help this particular person? That doesn't solve the problem, objected another. Leonardo, meanwhile, was unaware of all this. He stood a little apart, leaning against the wall, and watched the world around him change. Just yesterday, he was an empty place, invisible to others. Today, he was the hero of the news, the object of controversy and discussion. But did he feel better? Number? He felt lost. "This is wrong," he muttered, lowering his head. "I didn't ask for this." A man with a camera walked up to him and shoved the microphone right in his face. "How do you feel right now? How does it feel to become a hero overnight?" Leonardo looked at him with empty eyes. The tears had long since dried, leaving deep marks on his dirty cheeks. "I'm not a hero. I just wanted to be seen." His voice was almost inaudible. The journalist stepped back, not knowing what to say. Around Leonardo, the camera flashes continued to flicker, and the faces of passers-by, who were already drawing conclusions about his life without knowing anything about it. A little aside, Ronaldo watched silently. His jaw was tense, and his eyes were staring off into the distance, as if he was thinking about something important. He knew that this day would go beyond the usual act of charity. He knew that people would judge him. But right now, he only cared about one thing. Would Leonardo be able to rise from his knees despite the weight of this attention? "You don't have to do that," came a voice beside him. Ronaldo turned around. It was a man in an old coat, one of those standing among the crowd. But if you really believe him, give him a chance. Let this day be not just a show, but the beginning of something new. Ronaldo nodded. He had the same determination in his eyes as he had on the soccer field before the final whistle. "I've already given him that chance. Now it's up to him." The crowd continued to buzz, and somewhere in that noise, among the cameras and headlines, one man stood on the border of two worlds, the past that haunted him and the future he so feared. And no one knew what was next for Leonardo. The crowd gradually began to disperse. The news, the reports, the sensational headlines, it all went on living its life, but Leonardo himself felt lost amidst all the noise. His world was much quieter. The thoughts in his head, the emptiness in his chest, and Ronaldo's words echoing inside. "You deserve more than $1. But to realize that, you have to prove it to yourself." Leonardo couldn't get them out of his mind. Ronaldo didn't give him money. Instead, he gave him a choice that was far more frightening. Coming back to life is not just a step forward. It's a leap into the abyss with your eyes closed. The next morning, after a sleepless night on an old cardboard box under the bridge, Leonardo awoke to someone shaking him by the shoulder. A tall man in a dark overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase stood in front of him. He looked solid, but not aloof like many who passed by. "Are you Leonardo?" he asked, removing his glasses. "Who's asking?" Leonardo's voice was hoarse. My name is Ricardo. I work for one of the charities that Cristiano Ronaldo supports. He asked me to find you." The man sat down next to him and looked at Leonardo carefully. "Are you ready?" "Ready for what?" Leonardo raised a cloudy gaze at him. "To the second chance," Ricardo smiled, but there was something serious in his voice. "You have a choice." Ronaldo didn't just say that in public. He put his faith in you. The foundation is willing to give you housing, medical care, and a job. But it's not a gift. It's an opportunity you have to earn. Leonardo felt something prickle in his chest. Work, home. Words that had been commonplace before now sounded like they were from another life, from a past that was long gone. A wave of fear rose inside. What if I fail? What if everything falls apart again? "I can't," he muttered, lowering his gaze. "You can," Ricardo said firmly. "You've already taken the first step when you didn't turn away from help. Now you just need to take the second. Let's go." The car drove Leonardo away from the familiar streets. 2 hours later, he stood in front of a low building in the suburbs. It was a rehabilitation center and a temporary hostel for those who wanted to start a new life. Leonardo stepped inside with a heavy heart. He was greeted by medics, social workers, and psychologists. He felt small and helpless, but something inside said, "Give yourself a chance." The first days were hell. His body ached from the habit of the streets, from hunger and cold, and his soul whimpered with inner shame. The psychologist forced Leonardo to talk about the past, bringing long-hidden demons to light. Leonardo resisted, screamed, wanted to run back to the dark alleys where everything was familiar. But each time he remembered Ronaldo's gaze and his words, "You can do more." Weeks passed. Leonardo stood in front of the mirror for the first time in years, shaved and dressed in clean clothes. He didn't recognize himself. A haggard but alive man looked back at him from the other side of the glass. A month later, he started working in the warehouse. Simple work, heavy boxes, but he felt stronger every day. Every night, when he returned to his small room, he would write in his notebook, "I didn't give up today." But the real twist came the day he happened to hear on TV that Ronaldo was coming to the center for a charity event. Leonardo froze, his heart pounding so hard as if he were back in that very moment on the street. On the day of the meeting, the hall was full of people, journalists, volunteers, and those to whom Ronaldo had given a chance. Leonardo stood in the crowd, pressed against the wall. He was afraid to step forward, afraid that Ronaldo wouldn't recognize him. But suddenly, the footballer's eyes met his. "You're here." Ronaldo smiled and headed straight for him. Leonardo froze. His feet felt as if they were embedded in the floor. When Ronaldo came closer, he held out his hand, just as he had on that first day. "You did well," Ronaldo said. Leonardo looked up at him and tears filled his eyes again. "I'm still on my way," he whispered, squeezing the outstretched hand. "But I won't give up again." The crowd applauded, but to Leonardo, their noise was background. In that moment, he felt he had passed through the abyss and seen the light at the other end. His life was no longer a shadow. It belonged to him, step by step, day by day. This wasn't just a second chance. It was his new beginning. It's been a year since Cristiano Ronaldo stopped on a crowded street and heard the voice of a homeless stranger asking for just $1. The world has long forgotten about this story, but for Leonardo and Ronaldo it became a point of reference, the moment when everything changed. Leonardo stood in front of a small cafe, carefully adjusting the collar of his fresh shirt. On the glass was written in large letters, "The shining path helping everyone. He couldn't hold back a smile. This was his cafe, a small place for those who, like him, had once lost faith in themselves. Here, people could get a hot lunch, a job, and support. Inside, at wooden tables, sat people with similar stories, tired of life, but with new hope in their eyes. Some were washing dishes in the kitchen, some were wiping tables. Leonardo walked between them, stopping, listening, joking. His face was calm and his step confident. He was no longer hiding. "Leo, there are 2 people here to talk about work," a waitress shouted to him from across the room. "Okay, I'll be right there," he replied, heading for the door. When he stepped outside, there was already standing there a figure he recognized immediately. Cristiano Ronaldo, wearing a black jacket and dark glasses, smiled as he took them off. "You really did it," he said, nodding at the cafe sign. "I'm not the only one," Leonardo replied with a smile. "You gave me a chance, but I had to go on my own. And, you were right." "Right about what?" $1 wasn't needed. It was faith. Ronaldo nodded and looked out onto the sun-drenched street. "I knew you could do it," he said finally. "Sometimes all it takes is for someone to see you as a person, even when you don't." Leonardo couldn't hold back a smile. He looked at the man who had once challenged him and realized that this moment had forever intertwined their destinies. 2 very different worlds had converged at one point to create something greater. Not just a story, but a lesson. That afternoon, toward evening, new guests entered the cafe. A mother with a small boy, an old man with a tired face, and 2 young boys. Leonardo watched them sit down at their tables as the waitress brought out plates of hot soup. He saw their eyes, filled with gratitude and hope. That was his victory, not over circumstances but over himself. "Where do you find so much kindness?" one of his new employees once asked. Leonardo's answer was simple. "It was given to me. I'm just passing it on." That evening, the sun was setting over the horizon, casting golden and pink hues across the sky. Cristiano Ronaldo was leaving, but before he got into his car, he turned around and took one more look at the cafe. He knew this place would live on. It would become a refuge for those who had once, like Leonardo, lost themselves. "It's all for them," he said quietly to himself and smiled. The story spread around the world. People are talking again about how one gesture of kindness changed the life of not only one person, but dozens of others. She reminded each of us, sometimes all it takes is to see the other person, to hear them, to believe in them when they don't believe in themselves. This story is not just about Ronaldo, not just about Leonardo. It's a story about all of us, about the kindness that needs no reward, about how a little compassion can be the first step to a big miracle. And somewhere, in a bustling city, in the hustle and bustle, someone might reach out again and change someone's life, once and for all. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have there been cases in your life when a kindness, even the smallest one, changed something for the better? Share your thoughts and stories. Each of your comments is very important to us. We appreciate each of you and thank you for your support. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like if this story resonated with you. We wish you a good day and more good moments in your life.